Well, over the last few weeks, there have been some great people who have passed into the Lord's presence. Of course, Billy Graham went home to be with the Lord. Monday night, we had a celebration of life for Glenn Brown. Last night, Carol Goodman joined them. I imagine Glenn is showing her around. You know, Glenn's memorial, it's something when you reflect back on a life like the life that Glenn had lived. 17 years as a chaplain in the Navy. Retired from that and became a lead pastor, a career all in itself. Retired from that, moved to Sequim and started going to the Ukraine. And in the Ukraine, he helped start a chaplain program for the military in what had been a former atheist Soviet bloc country. After that got going, he started speaking, teaching with pastors in various churches, and founded a children's home for orphans, the Eunice Brown Children's Home, there in the Ukraine. And then, just to top it off, at about age 72, he decided to embark on a career as a writer. And if you've known Glenn very long, you've probably been given at least one of his books. But by the time he passed away at age 90, he had completed 8 of them. Not bad. Last Sunday, I was told that there were 3 of you that volunteered to help in the toddler class. Thank you. And maybe if you volunteered, you give them a hand. You know, maybe if you were one of those people that volunteered to help in the toddler class or something else like that, you may be looking at that and thinking, wow, compared to a Glenn Brown or a Billy Graham or a Carol Goodman, I don't think I'm doing all that much. And I suppose on one scale that may be true, but on the other hand, it struck me that at some point, Glenn Brown and Billy Graham and Carol Goodman all were toddlers. Somebody gave their time to care for those toddlers, to love them, to show them the love of Jesus, and had no idea that what they were actually shaping in that little toddler, doing what seemed like something insignificant, was actually an individual that was going to impact and help shape their generation. I want you to let that thought kind of settle in your mind as we work through today's passage. Unfortunately, our passage doesn't begin on such happy thoughts. It begins a fair bit darker. Last week, we saw what happened as Jesus, having now come into Jerusalem for the Passover feast, his first stop is in the temple. And if you recall what happened in the temple, he goes in and he sees that in the court of Gentiles, which was supposed to be the place where the non-Jews who wanted to worship God were welcomed into the temple to bring their worship, to have a place to be in God's presence, that it had been compromised and overrun because the priests had decided that it would make a nice marketplace to sell animals for use by the Jews in their temple worship. So no longer was it a place of quiet, no longer was it a place of worship, it was now a flea market, if you will. And Jesus saw that and he was enraged. And you recall that he made a whip and he drove them out. And he said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Well, the result of that was that those priests, those leaders, began trying to set a series of traps to hopefully ensnare Jesus and trip him up and discredit him and give cause for him to be arrested. As we looked at last week, Jesus cleverly evaded all of the traps. Not only evaded the traps, in the process, he pretty well humiliated the people that were trying to set them. He pointed out their hypocrisy and he even spoke words of judgment, predicting their downfall. I told the story about my friend Paul and I being kids and discovering that giant wasp nest out in the field hanging from a thistle, and how we pulled up an old pickup truck and we took a baseball bat and we hit that thing, and then we jumped in the truck and watched those wasps just go nuts. And in essence, that's what Jesus has done. He has walked right into the hotbed of hypocrisy, and he has swatted that thing good and hard. And they're mad. Here's what Mark chapter 14, verse 1 has to say, "It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people.'" Mark gives us a very specific time frame. He says that this was 2 days before the Passover feast. I told you a couple weeks ago that Mark has been described by some as a passion narrative, that is the story of the final week of Jesus' life. Mark can be thought of as a passion narrative with an introduction. It is the shortest of the Gospels, and yet a hugely disproportionate amount of Mark's story is dedicated to the last week of Jesus' life. Everything seems to lead up to this point. Jesus has been constantly on the move. One of Mark's favorite words is immediately. Immediately this, immediately that. And yet now suddenly, it's as though time slows down. And Mark says it's now 2 days before the Passover. Here's what starts to happen. It says that these leaders wanted to arrest Jesus by stealth. Why so stealthy? Why so sneaky? Well, their worry is that there is going to be an uproar. We've seen this kind of thing before, haven't we? Back in Mark chapter 11, verse 18, it says the chief priests and the scribes were seeking a way to destroy him. They feared him because the crowd was astonished at his teaching. Jesus is gaining a lot of credibility, a lot of following among the people. And they see him as a threat to their authority. But it also scares them how much support he has from the people. And you remember that at one point they challenged Jesus' authority. By whose authority do you do these things? And Jesus said, well, I'll answer that question if you can answer me by whose authority John the Baptist did what he was doing. And you may remember the incident where they begin to debate this, and they're saying, wow, if we say that John is from heaven, he's going to say, then why didn't you listen to him? If we say it's from man, well, they were afraid of the people. Because not only did Jesus have a lot of credibility, John the Baptist had a lot of credibility, and they were afraid of getting the people upset. Mark chapter 12, verse 12, when Jesus told this story about a bunch of greedy vineyard tenants that refused to give produce to the landowner and in fact ultimately killed his son, they figure out this story really is about them. And it says they were seeking to arrest him, but they feared the people. They had good reason to fear. Riots were not uncommon in Jerusalem, especially during Passover. You had 300,000 people plus that showed up in that city. There are swarms of people, and they are excitable people, and they are fervent people. And there's a lot of pent-up resentment as well among them. There's resentment toward the government. There's resentment toward the religious leaders. What their fear tells me is that while they had political power, they did not have moral authority. They were not respected by the people as great spiritual leaders. And so the leaders are afraid to lay hands on Jesus because they know that the crowd does not respect them. So their plan is to wait for the crowds to dissipate. And what do they want to do when the pressure is off? What do they want to do when nobody's looking? Did they want to exile Jesus? Send him to some far-off place? Maybe put him under arrest, kind of keep him in a dungeon someplace? No, he says they wanted to kill him. You have to let that one set in for a minute. The religious leaders of Israel in the temple are meeting together for the express purpose of deciding how they can kill a man. Now, these are the authorities of Israel. They are the specialists in the law. They're referred to as experts in the law. They debated endlessly all the fine points and the minutiae of the law. What was the most foundational part of the law that they had? The 10 Commandments, right? What was commandment number 5? You shall not murder. Now, there were exceptions that God had ordained. There were times that capital punishment in a rightful court of law was allowed. A soldier defending his country was allowed in war to kill. But what was not allowed was to kill for my own purposes, to selfishly take the law in my own hands and to take another life. And yet, here are these men, supposedly experts in the law, that somehow don't feel any contradiction in having a serious strategic discussion at the highest level about how to plot the murder of an innocent man. You know, if you had challenged them on this, I'm sure they would have had a reason. They would have had a justification for why this wasn't really a bad thing. In fact, this was a good thing. This was a necessary thing. They would have, I think, felt compelled to give you a good reason. How is it that supposedly righteous people can justify things that are so patently wrong? I saw something years ago. Our oldest son, Michael, and I had a chance to go to Cambodia. And we got to see some of the effects of what had happened under the reign of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot. Horrible stuff. Millions of people slaughtered. One of the things that struck me was going through the notorious torture prison that was in Phnom Penh. Thousands of people came through what had been a junior high school and was turned into this horrendous prison. Of the tens of thousands that passed through, the number that came out alive, I believe, was somewhere around 200. It was a death sentence to go in there. Tiny little bricked-in cells people were held in, and then they were taken into these classrooms, which had been turned into the torture chambers. This bed was where they would chain someone down, and then they'd proceed to torture them to get a confession out of them. Here's the way confessions worked. If you were accused of betraying the state, of bringing Western ideology in whatever form, maybe it's because you had glasses on or you had fillings in your teeth, those things would get you killed because it showed that you've been westernized. So you would be interrogated to reveal, to confess to the evil that you had done in being influenced by the West. And if you admitted that you had been influenced, that you were in fact a traitor, then you'd be put to death, as would your family and friends. Now, if you did not confess, if you maintained that you were innocent, then you would be tortured because you obviously were lying until you were dead, and then your family and friends would be put to death. So it doesn't matter which way you go, you're going to die. And your family and friends are going to die as well. Now here's the crazy part. In a corner of every room, there was a little desk and a chair. You know what the desk and chair were for? It was for a secretary that was keeping track of the confessions to write them down to make this all legal and proper. Does that strike you as bizarre? It doesn't matter what the person says, they're going to be killed. Who cares about the confession? In fact, why even bother with the confession? Why even bother with the torture? What's the point? You're just going to kill them. Why not get on with it? But you see, there is something inside of us. It is this mystery of moral knowledge that even when we are doing wrong, even when we're doing evil, there is still this sense of that somehow I still need to be right. I still need to somehow justify myself. But justify myself to what? To whom? Why? Where does this mystery of moral knowledge come from? Sometimes believers are challenged about the problem of evil. How do you explain a good God in the presence of evil in the world? To which I would say there's another question even more fundamental than that, which is, if there is no God, where did you get this idea of evil? Who's to say that anything is evil? It's just different. But we actually have an inner sense that tells us that some things are intrinsically good and some things are just bad. And if we know it's bad, we start looking for a way to somehow make it good. We want to rationalize and justify it. C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, talks about this law of human nature. Here's what he says. Everyone has heard people quarreling. They say things like this: how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? Or, that's my seat, I was there first. Or, give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine. The man who makes these statements is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. The other man nearly always tries to make out that what he's been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there is some special excuse. We believe in decency so much. We feel the rule of law pressing on us so that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it. And consequently, we try to shift the responsibility. And then I love these two observations. First, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. Secondly, they do not, in fact, behave in that way. We should be angry at what these men were plotting, but we shouldn't consider ourselves exempt. I've heard women justify gossip that cut others apart as simply sharing a prayer request. I've heard men justify rages that left wives and children cowering in fear, and they justified it as just being because people weren't listening to them. I've had men and women walking away from a family give me litanies of justifications as to why they're actually doing the right thing, trying to absolve themselves of the emotional violence they're doing to wives, husbands, and children. We justify all kinds of things, don't we? We justify one more drink over the limit because it's been a stressful day. We justify one more little lie because it's necessary to fix the problem for the, greater good. We justify that binge on our credit card because we really need that shiny new thing. And yet, in the recesses of our heart, if we're really honest, despite our best rationalizations, we know that there are things that we embrace, there are things that we do that are not right, and it bothers us. To paraphrase C.S. Lewis, we have this curious idea that we ought to behave in a certain way, but we do not, in fact, behave that way. We want to be right, we want to justify ourselves, we want to modify the rules to fit our behavior. We may even deny the rules exist because that might extricate us from the guilt. We engage in all sorts of compensating behavior, trying to backfill the craters that we've created. But you want to hear something really amazing? There's another way. Luke 23, this is at the crucifixion. These priests, these religious leaders, they now have got what they want. Jesus is dying. The soldiers gathered there, cast lots to divide his garments. The people stood by watching. The rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself. If he's the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This is the miracle of the gospel. The miracle of the gospel is that God knows exactly. He sees through our justifications and our rationalizations. He knows exactly what we've done. And in the depths of our heart, some of the things we've done aren't very pretty. And we can't backfill it. We can't earn our way out of it. We can't change the rules to make it okay. And yet God sends his son into the middle of that broken world, even to be killed by evil, angry people. And he opens up a door of forgiveness. He says, "There is grace. I will take the punishment that you deserve. I will carry that burden myself. And I offer you a way to be set free." Facing the reality of ourselves can be a crushing thing, but when seen in the light of grace, it is a doorway to freedom. Tragically, these men were so deeply ensnared in their lust for control that they were blind to the evil they were plotting against an innocent man. Well, that's one side of the story. There's a happier side to this story, and that is the story of a very extravagant woman, a woman whose only desire is to bless Jesus. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, he was reclining at table. A woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment and pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Mark doesn't tell us the woman's name, but John does. John says her name was Mary. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Why did she do that? Why pour perfume all over this guy? Mark says she poured it on his head. John says, and she poured it on his feet. She poured it all over. Why? Well, it wasn't uncommon to anoint a guest of honor at a feast in that day. But Mary had a deeper motive, I think. For Mary, this was about gratitude. Because what we know about Mary is her brother was a guy named Lazarus. And if you know the story of Lazarus, Lazarus had died. He'd gotten sick, he had died, and Jesus had done the unimaginable. He had called Lazarus out of the grave and restored him to life. Mary is grateful beyond words. And it draws out of her this extravagant gesture of love toward the most honored guest at the table. Sadly, her gift gets a very strange response from many of those seated there. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that? This ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. Giving alms to the poor was a regular part of the Passover celebration. And so at a very positive level, they're saying, wow, we could have done a lot with this. We could have helped a lot of poor people if we'd sold this and given it to them. The gift was extravagant. A denarius was equal to a day's wages. So if this was worth 300, that's basically a year's salary that this bottle of perfume was worth. Why were they upset? Well, maybe it was just they thought it was too much of a good thing. John tells us that the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Yeah? It's overpowering. Like, good grief, woman. We could have given this to the poor. It reeks in here now. Maybe it was arrogance. This is one of those cases of men figuring they know better than women what to do. Stupid woman, you just wasted all that perfume. We could have helped all the poor. And in their arrogance, they think they know what was the better thing to do. There's one other factor in play, but we'll consider that a little bit later. But look what Jesus does. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good to them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Leave her alone. Stop lecturing her. What she has done is a beautiful thing. She doesn't even realize that she has just seized a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This isn't to say don't care for the poor, but he says there will always be poor. You will be able on any day to go and give and help the poor. But right now there's something unique happening, and she has seized that moment. How significant that a woman who had received her brother back from the dead at the word of Jesus, who had called him out of the tomb, in an act of gratitude, has unknowingly prepared Jesus for he himself to enter into a tomb. And yet it's a tomb that Jesus, not called by someone else, but by his own power, is going to walk back out of. And in doing that, he's going to open the door for life, for all. She didn't know any of that. She wasn't thinking big picture like that. But here's what she did. She has done what she could. Like that widow with the 2 pennies that Jesus called attention to in the temple, and he said, she's given more than all of these wealthy people around here because she's given everything that she had. There's real generosity. He says, this woman has done something more significant than any of you understand. She's prepared my body for burial. Now, I would contend that that is an odd dinner conversation to have. If you're having dinner at a friend's house this afternoon, and someone comes and puts some perfume on them, you're going to think that's a little odd to begin with, but give that to them. But if they then say, wow, this is great because what they've just done is they've helped prepare my body for burial, that's a conversation stopper right there. But that's what Jesus says. Then he says, what she has done will be remembered. He says, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done is going to be remembered. Folks, you are sitting in Sequim, Washington. Any farther north, you're either a Canadian or a duck. You are on the far side of the world from Israel 2,000 years after the event, and we are still talking about this lady did with that bottle of perfume. Here's the application. Jesus honors small people doing generous things. That comes up repeatedly. He feeds a crowd of 4,000 with a few loaves and fish that a small boy gives him. He recognizes a widow who gives up her 2 little coins as being the most generous of all. And a woman who gave up an expensive bottle of perfume is still being talked about as an example of kindness, love, and gratitude. The greatest in God's kingdom may often appear to be the least. What matters is not the size of the gift, but is the heart that gives it. Some have been entrusted with much. They've been given great gifts, great ability, great opportunity. I was in California a couple weeks ago for a conference, and on Sunday, Burnett and I decided that we would go and visit Rick Warren's church at Saddleback Community. Now, if you know, Saddleback Community is one of the largest churches, evangelical churches in the United States. On a Sunday morning, between the main campus and the satellite campuses, they have 20,000 people on a Sunday morning. That would say they attend Saddleback. We went to the mothership. If you're going to experience the real deal, right? And it's impressive. I mean, it's huge. The parking lot is so huge. Okay, we're not talking about coming off the street. We're talking in the church parking lot. They have a full-on traffic light with a dedicated left turn signal. That is our new church goal, folks. We are going to put a traffic light in. Listen, God has given Rick Warren wonderful gifts. He's a great leader, and he has done so much for the gospel to share Christ with thousands. Praise God for that. He's been given much. He has done much with it. We're not all Rick Warrens. Some of us have been given the gifts to volunteer to help with the toddlers on a Sunday morning. It's not the size of the gift that matters. It's the heart that gives it. The question is, what are we doing with what we've been given? Jesus said to this woman, she has done what she could. I said the size of the gift doesn't matter. That's not entirely true. What determines the appropriate size of the gift is the size of what you've been given. Here's what Luke says. Great gifts mean great responsibilities. Greater gifts, greater responsibilities. If you were Rick Warren, given the opportunities and the gifts and the abilities that Rick has, and all you did was volunteer in the nursery, that would not be a generous act that God would smile on. He'd say, I gave you more than that. But if that's what God has given you, God is pleased. The same Lord that looks at a widow giving her 2 mites and says, she's the most generous one here, looks at every person who gives whatever they have back to him in praise and says, that is a good gift. This wouldn't be a bad gravestone, would it? She has done what she could for Jesus. He has done what he could for Jesus. Are you doing what you can? This little lady would probably be embarrassed if she knew we were still talking about it. But you have no idea why God may be prompting you to step out in faith and what he may do if you'll take that step of obedience. Sadly, our story doesn't end there. Now we come to an embittered traitor, a very different kind of heart, the heart of Judas. We looked earlier at Jesus going up to Jerusalem, and you recall he's striding out, and there's some that it says were actually afraid as they see Jesus heading to Jerusalem. He's been talking about his death, he's been talking about rejection, and now he's heading there, and they're afraid. And I really wonder if Judas was one of those who was afraid. He's getting worried because he's heard Jesus talking about rejection and death and confrontation. And Judas thought he was signing up for success and greatness. Now in Jerusalem, he has seen Jesus go toe-to-toe with the elite, and it's no secret they hate Jesus. In fact, John tells us that the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders, if anyone knew where Jesus was, to let them know so they could arrest him. I think Judas had got wind of that. He knows this is going to end badly. Maybe the perfume was the final straw for Judas. John gives us a little more detail. I said there was another factor in play. Well, here it is. Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Somewhere along the line, Judas concluded that if following Jesus was going to pay off, it was going to pay off because he was going to pay himself. And maybe Judas had already been talking to Mary, and he knew about this perfume. Maybe they'd been talking about selling it, giving the alms. Maybe Judas kind of had his eye on it, and he's thinking, when that money hits the bag, I am definitely taking a cut. In fact, maybe that was his exit strategy. Maybe he figures, one more dip into the till, and I'm out of here before things get really bad. And now, this woman has just ruined the whole thing. She spilled the whole bottle of perfume. There's no money in it now. And Judas is mad. He's been tagging along, hoping things are going to pay off, but in the meantime, he's going to pay himself. He's gotten tired about this talk of giving all you have and the least being the greatest, because he says that just isn't the way the world works. Maybe he was embarrassed at being rebuked by Jesus when Jesus said, "Leave her alone." And he's tired. He's tired of this rabbi that always seems to speak in paradoxes and always seems to say that he's got his values upside down. And it doesn't seem he ever has enough faith to make Jesus happy. And he's decided that it's time to do what needs to be done. It's time for Judas to take care of Judas. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. Maybe Mary was content to do what she could for Jesus, no matter the cost. But Judas has decided he is going to get what he can from Jesus one way or another. I'd wrap it up like this. The first is a warning. The warning is that pride and illicit desires can easily hide behind a cascade of rationalizations. And if we refuse to take an honest look at our hearts, our motives, we can find ourselves slipping to places that we never thought we would go. The good news is that we don't need to rationalize. We don't need to hide. We don't need to try and prove to God we're not really that kind of person, because he knows who we are. And he came to seek and to save people who were lost in the darkness of their own selfish schemes. He went to the cross to open the path, not just for sweet Marys, but for corrupt priests as well. I think there's even hope for Judas if he'd been willing to turn back. And an encouragement. Maybe you feel like that small person. You love God with all your heart. Maybe you don't feel you have a lot to give. There's not a lot that you can pour out. And you wonder if it really matters. I just want you to know that God is pleased. God sees your heart. And whether your gift is great or small, extravagant or mundane, understood or viewed as foolish, if it's given with a full heart, if you're giving back all that he's given to you, he is bragging to you, bragging about you to any angel that will listen. Mary was commended because she did what she could, and Jesus used it for far more than she ever imagined. May we do likewise. Amen.